We're going to turn to Genesis chapter 22, and we're going to read the next section of the great story of Abraham, which we've been following. It's actually the last section of our great story of Abraham as well this morning. John's going to come and read for us. So page 26, Genesis chapter 22. Thanks, John.
Yeah, as it says up there, I'm only going to read up to verse 19. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba.
Well, let's put those thoughts aside and let's come to Genesis 22. So if you're here regularly, and don't worry if you're not, and if you're here for the first time, we've thrilled you with us. That's absolutely great. But we have for quite a while now been looking at the life of Abraham in Genesis, and we're getting to the end of the Genesis account of Abraham, and this will actually be our final sermon in this series. Excuse me. We have this incredible incident in chapter 22 recorded for us, which is quite shocking, really. And we're going to be diving into that in a moment. I wonder if you've ever been presented by somebody with a plan that you're pretty sure won't work. You might think that plan is just stupid. Maybe you've been in a work situation and the boss comes up with a new idea and everyone's thinking, you've just got no clue, that's just not going to work. Or somebody's in a family setting, or a friend, as they've got some harebrained scheme. You think that's crazy, that's just not going to work. So probably most of us can think of some example of that. Here, it seems the most absolutely ludicrous idea that God comes to Abraham with. Now, because we've read it and we know what happens, we can see where it's heading. But at the start of the story, you think, this is absolutely crazy. How can this be a good plan? Well, as we dive in and look at this, I've got three things that I particularly want us to notice or think about. We've got the challenge of what God asks, and it does seem absolutely crazy. We've got the resource that God provides, and we've got the blessing that God promises. So we'll look at those in turn. So the first one of those is the challenge of what God asks. Excuse me. And as our chapter opened in verse 1, we're a little bit. It tells us we're a little bit later on than the events of the previous chapter. So Isaac, Abraham's son, is perhaps now in his mid-teens. It's not absolutely clear, but he's certainly no longer a toddler, and he's able to carry a bundle of wood. So he's perhaps mid-teens, and God comes to Abraham. And verse 1 tells us to test him. There's a test presented to Abraham. It's a test of faith or trust in God. And in some ways, his whole life has been building up to this. Because if you've been with us over recent weeks, as we've walked with Abraham, since really just after Easter, we've been following Abraham's story. And we've seen the challenges that Abraham and Sarah faced in having children, in having a child, in having this son that years, decades earlier, God had promised to him. There's been all kinds of ups and downs along the way, and finally the baby arrived. He's now growing. God had not only promised the son, but promised descendants through the son. And so this request that God comes to Abraham with, absolutely shocking. You've got to sacrifice your son. Absolutely shocking and completely at odds with everything else that Abraham has heard from God. Because based on what he's previously heard, how can any harm come to Isaac? Isaac's going to not only have children, but have many descendants coming from him. He's the child of promise. He was promised, but God's promises, wider promises to Abraham, are fulfilled through Isaac. And although Abraham's had other children, God has been very clear, no, it's not through them, it's through this child, the child of promise. So there's a conflict here between God's promise and what God's commanding. It's like, how do these two fit together? They don't seem like there's any way they could possibly fit together. It just doesn't add up. It's like me sitting in my GCSE maths exam. Actually, they weren't called GCSEs then, but it just doesn't add up. I just can't work it out. God is asking Abraham in verse 2 to give it all up. To give it all up. Verse 2, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. It's almost like God is rubbing it in, isn't it? Because take your son, your only son. Now we know he's had other children, but he's the only son he's got now. And he's the only son that God has said is the son of promise. Whom you love. It's not even like, he's the child that you don't really love. Your son, your only son, whom you love. But God's not rubbing it in. He's showing he understands what he's asking. He understands how big a thing this is that he's asking of Abraham. I don't know if you've ever had that experience of being at a beach and building a sandcastle when the tide's coming in. We used to do this a lot when our kids were younger. In fact, we still do it actually when we go to the beach. And it's a good day if you know that the tide's going to be coming in, because that means you can try and build some defences against the sea. And we often have like a proper big shovel with us, so we can build something really quite colossal. And it can be quite sobering that sort of 4 hours work in the hot sun digging sand can be destroyed in about 2 minutes by a big wave. You just cannot hold the sea back with piles of sand. You just can't. It can all be washed away. But Abraham's been asked really to give up his life's work. Not just 4 hours building a sandcastle. All he's been working for, all he's been waiting for so long. This precious child. It's not even he's been asked to give up his life's work. He's been asked to give up his son. Well, what will he do? A dilemma being placed in front of him. Well, there's no messing about. Verse 3 tells us, early next morning, Abraham got up, loaded his donkey, took with him 2 servants and his son Isaac. He sets off. He's obedient right away. Gathers some wood, loads up, and off they go. It's about 40 miles away, or a 3-day journey. That's a lot of time to think and ponder, isn't it, on your way? Imagine what's going through his mind, bless him. That's the turmoil and torment. But Abraham has faith. It seems like it doesn't match up, does it? What God's promised and what God's commanding. How can they match up? But Abraham has faith. There's some clues to it here. Verse 5, when they get to close to the place, he says to the servants, "You stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back." Not just me. We will come back. And then when Isaac starts to piece together, hold on, there's something missing here. We've got the wood, we've got the fire, his dad's carrying a big knife. Where's the lamb? What's his answer? Verse 8, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Now, what's going on here in his reply? I've just said Abraham. There's a clues to Abraham's faith. Is it faith and belief in God, or just desperation? Desperation. I can't tell the servants that maybe only one of us will come back. I can't tell my son, you're going to be the lamb, or instead of a lamb. Well, the altar gets built. The wood is positioned and the boy is tied up. And the drama, as in verse 10, he reached out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. It's almost like, it's hovering above him. The knife is raised. Total obedience to God. Now we might think, what is Abraham thinking at this point? What is he thinking? What is going through his mind? But actually we know what is going through his mind, because the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews 11, tells us, and I've put it on the screen for us, it says, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He whom had embraced the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son. So it's underlining for us, his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, it's through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned. That's how this great blessing of many offspring, it's actually through Isaac. And then it tells us what's going on in Abraham's mind. Abraham reasoned, this is his thinking, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. So the knife doesn't actually fall, but he's gone as far as being seconds away from that point. And it says, Abraham reckoned God could raise him from the dead. Now that is astonishing, I think. An amazing feat of reasoning I don't know how good you are at reasoning things out, working things out, but many of us know not just this story from the Bible, but we know the whole Bible story, or lots of events and things that happen in the Bible. And because of that, we know, well, of course God could do that. Of course God can raise the dead. But here we are, just a few pages into the Bible. Abraham doesn't have the benefit of all that knowledge that we have if we read the Bible. And he's working this out. It's absolutely amazing. I think it's something similar that has been picked up in fiction. I don't know if you're like Sherlock Holmes. I've got a quote from... Sherlock Holmes says this in the book The Sign of Four. He says, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I want to do something like that. I'm pretty sure Abraham hadn't read Sherlock Holmes. But something like that is going on in Abraham's thinking. Hebrews says he reckoned, I've got these promises from God. I know I can trust these promises. I've got this command from God, which doesn't seem to line up, but somehow it must. Somehow it must. Well, this whole thing seems sort of barbaric, doesn't it? What is going on here? Yeah, is God sanctioning child sacrifice? I mean, later he is very against some of the Canaanites who practice child sacrifice. What's going on here? It seems just barbaric. Now, here's the thing, though. God doesn't want Isaac's life. He wants Abraham's heart. God doesn't want Isaac's life. He wants Abraham's heart. This is about Abraham's faith. It's absolutely astonishing, isn't it? Absolutely astonishing test of faith. And I cannot imagine if I was in that situation, what would I do? If I was in that situation, if God was asking that of me, what would I do? Now, the great news is God's almost certainly not going to ask you to do something very similar to this. But I wonder what is God asking you to do? Is there something that God is showing you? There's a situation where you need to trust him, although it's very hard to see his plan. He's asking you to trust him, although it's very hard to see how he's working things out. Perhaps you're looking at something and think, this is very, very difficult. I'm looking at what's ahead. It's very difficult. Or perhaps you're right in a very difficult time. Not exactly like this situation, but maybe it's something to do with health. Maybe it's money worries. Maybe it's job insecurity. Or worries about things that are going on within the family. I think if you're a parent, there's always worries about things that are going on in the family. A difficult thing. A thing where you're having to trust God, although you cannot see his full plan in this or how he's working things out. And there are folk in our church family, even perhaps in this room, who have had to trust God through some very, very difficult things. Life-threatening illness, the death of a loved one, addiction, rape, unjust accusation and threat, all kinds of really hard things. Or perhaps you're quite new to Christian things, and you're thinking, is the Bible really true? Is it God's word? Can I trust him? Is Jesus really God's son? Can God really be calling me to give up, I don't know, fill in the blank, in order to follow him? Well, the Bible doesn't call us to blind faith, whether we're a Christian facing hard situations or we're just looking into Christian things and we're pondering it and we're reasoning things through in our mind. We're not called to blind faith, a sort of leap of faith. Faith in the Bible is based on God, his character and his promises. It's based on what we know of him and is revealed of him in his word. And so, although faith is still faith, it's still putting our trust in him, taking him at his word, and that can be hard. It's not a leap in the dark. Abraham has walked with God now for decades. He's seen God's faithfulness. He's seen the foolishness of going away from God's ways. And he reasoned out, I can't say how this fits together, but I'm going to trust God. So that's a lesson for us individually. It's also a lesson for us as a church collectively, isn't it? There are all kinds of challenges that we face as a church, challenges of change and growth. Can we trust him? Well, yes, we can. The Christian life is lifelong learning, isn't it? It's learning that we can trust God, sometimes with the small things, and that enables us to trust him with the big things. I read a quote as I was preparing this week. I really liked it. It said, "Never doubt in the dark what God has told you in the light." So I like that. It's when you're in the middle of the dark thing, when you're in the middle of the challenge, when you're in the middle of the sort of, I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, never doubt in the dark what God has told you in the light. Remember the things that you learned when it maybe wasn't so dark, and walk in the light of those. Well, that was the first thing, the challenge of what God asks. Let's go on to think about the resource that God provides. This picture is a place in Croatia, somewhere near Spit, I think. It's a picture of in the middle of the picture there's a Spit's a place, not like somebody's spit. It's a picture of a complex of church buildings and things, but it's one of the oldest church buildings anywhere. The oldest, best preserved church buildings. Part of that complex was built around 450. So 450, that's really comparatively close to the time of Christ, really. Very ancient and old church building. We'll come back to that in a minute. Anyway, let's go on with the story of Abraham, the resources that God provides. Remember, the knife is raised. Verse 10 and 11, he's taken the knife, but the call comes, stop! Actually, it's not stop, it's Abraham, Abraham. The angel of the Lord calls out to him, here I am, he replied, do not lay a hand on the boy. Verse 12, and we all breathe a massive sigh of relief. At that darkest hour, that darkest point, when the light was most needed, it comes, doesn't it? And something has been provided, a perfect substitute. Verse 13, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by his horns. Just the perfect alternative to Isaac. You think, how did he not notice this before? You know, they've been there a while, they've been building this thing. Been tying him up and everything. How's he not noticed this before? It's a bit like last time there's a well of water suddenly in the desert not being noticed. I think, well, sometimes you don't notice things, but I think God can supernaturally hide or reveal things if he wants to, can't he? But suddenly he notices that there's this ram, caught, and Abraham renames the place, verse 14, the Lord will provide. And it says, to this day, when this has been written down, it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So the Lord provides, and the little editor's note there says, and he still does, and he still does. Now here's the interesting thing. 1,000 years after these events, or maybe just a little bit less than that, but a long centuries after these events, Solomon builds a temple on this place. On this place, Solomon builds a temple. 2 Chronicles 3 tells us it is the same place, Moriah. It's the place where sacrifices are made to deal with sin by people in the Old Testament times. And 1,000 years after that temple is built by Solomon, just very close to this same place, maybe just a bit further along the same ridge, another long-promised son who'd had a miraculous birth and who was loved by his father was not tied up with ropes on an altar, but was nailed with iron nails to a cross. There's 3 events all happening the same geographical location or in the very close vicinity. As verse 8 said, God himself will provide a lamb. Abraham revealed his faith in saying that, I think. We've already heard from Hebrews what he'd reasoned in his mind. God himself will provide a lamb. Hear what John the Baptist says in John chapter 1, and I've got it on the screen for us. John 1:29. The next day, John saw Jesus coming towards him, and he said, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." John identifies Jesus as a sacrificial lamb, sacrificed to take away the sin of the world. Another substitute, another who can step in, another provision from God. And so this story in Genesis, although it's so far away in the Bible timeline from the first Easter, it helps us understand the cross. It helps us understand the substitute takes away sin by taking the penalty. Now, do you remember that church in Croatia? Inside there's a mosaic. 450 is quite close to Roman times. You know, the Romans were famous for mosaics on floors and everything. There's a mosaic in that church, that really ancient church, of this picture. I think it's amazing, actually. A bit hard to see what's going on, but you can obviously see a lamb in a circle. But behind it, you can perhaps see the top and the bottom and the sides. It's on a cross. There's a cross in the background behind the lamb. And you can perhaps see, it's kind of hard to see, but the lamb is punctured in its chest. And there's a spurt of blood coming out into a cup that looks like a sort of communion cup. And even way back then, 450, people are making images in this very ancient church showing Jesus as a lamb upon the cross, showing a sort of fatal wound. And that connection to the communion cup. And of course, the wine in communion remind us of Jesus' blood shed. So we do look back to these events in Genesis, but more importantly to the events of the cross. And as we share bread and wine together, as we do regularly here and we did last week, it reminds us of Jesus taking our place as a substitute on the cross. And this story helps us understand the idea of a substitute provided. But let me ask you, what do you see when you look at the cross of Jesus Christ? Do you see the barbaric brutality that there is? Does it seem very unnecessary to kill somebody so young and who had such a promising future and did so much good? Does it seem futile? Or do you look at the cross and see it as a glorious thing, a joyous thing? Do you see it as a liberating thing, a life-giving thing? Do you see it as actually a death-swallowing thing? Do you see the joy of being a bit like Isaac, whose place was suddenly swapped out for a substitute? Imagine how Isaac felt about that. Absolutely amazing. Well, the claim of the Bible is that we can feel that joy as Jesus takes our place, as he is our substitute. I wonder if these are things that you've thought about for a long time, or if this are quite new ideas to you. It's worth exploring more, isn't it? Come and speak to me or somebody else here. We regularly have a course called Christian Explored that helps you think more about these things. But maybe you've thought about these things for a long time. Just let's see once again the wonder and the joy of it. Well, let's move on to the third and final thing, and a bit more quickly. The blessing that God promises. Verse 12, God confirms that Abraham has passed the test. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son, says God. James, the book of James, we won't turn to it, but James chapter 2 tells us that faith without works is dead. We can say we have faith in God, but does that actually turn into some actual action, actually doing anything, says James. And that's exactly what we see here. Abraham has faith in God, but he actually acts on it, doesn't he? I remember back in the 1990s, I worked with a guy called Alan Park. Alan Park told me this great story about when he'd visited a Rolls-Royce, but not Rolls-Royce cars, Rolls-Royce aero engines, who make the massive engines for aeroplanes. And he was an engineer, and he didn't work for Rolls-Royce, but he was there visiting and seeing how they tested their aero engines. And he said it was amazing. They had a chicken cannon, and they would get a chicken, and the cannon would fire the chicken into the aero engine. Absolutely amazing. The engine would be going, and they would fire with this cannon, fire a chicken into it. And the idea was to test the engines for bird strike, what they call bird strike, when birds can end up going into the aero engine. The idea is not that they were trying to destroy the aero engine with chickens, but it's to prove that it can stand up to it. That's the idea. That's the idea. God has tested Abraham not to destroy him or to destroy Isaac, but to prove, not his airworthiness, but to prove that his faith is genuine. Sometimes God introduces things into our lives, not to destroy us, but to confirm our trust in him. We're now here in chapter 22, and that is actually 10 chapters after chapter 12, where God had made a promise to Abraham. We've had 10 chapters, and we've looked at this over numerous weeks, haven't we? But here, at the end of chapter 22, he reaffirms the promises from chapter 12. The promises that Abraham will have many descendants, that he will have a land, that he will be blessed. And in fact, all peoples will be blessed through him. And immediately, in the very next chapter, we get the first legal ownership of some land as Abraham agrees to buy a field and a cave where Sarah, who has lived to a good old age but has now died, is going to be buried. And actually quite a lot of the family will subsequently be buried in this cave. We had hints of it last week, you might remember, with ownership rights over a well. But now there's a whole massive section about the legal exchange that goes on, how he now owns a bit of this land that was promised way back in chapter 12. He now owns legally part of it. But in verse 18, just at the end of our reading, it reminds again that the blessing doesn't just come to Abraham, but actually all nations on earth will be blessed. So that's you and I getting a mention in there. All nations on earth will be blessed. And that blessing comes through the Lord Jesus. Jesus will come from Isaac's line. He will be descendant of Isaac, this child who was laid on these pieces of wood. The blessing comes in a kind of general way as God's influence in the world is for good. As Christians started hospitals and education and sought to remove injustice and tried to produce stable societies and law and order and social cohesion and all that. I was looking for a picture of a cave. I love this picture because it's looking out from the darkness to the light. The blessings that flow from following God's ways do take you from darkness to light. But there's a much more significant part of this blessing. It's not about an earthly kingdom or bringing Christendom to the world and the sort of benefits that might flow from that. And it's not always been positive. People have done bad things in the name of Christianity as well. But actually, the more significant thing here actually is the heavenly kingdom. Being able to be joined as part of God's family, included because of Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross. So that's a tremendous blessing that's on offer to us today, that we accept by faith, as Abraham accepted God's blessing by faith. Is he trustworthy? Well, yes, he is. Abraham has proved that. Many here would say that they have found God to be trustworthy. That's the way into the Christian life as we put our faith in him. But it's also the way on in the Christian life. We keep trusting him. It was the same for Abraham, wasn't it? He had to trust God initially, but it's been the way on has been to keep trusting him. Well, with those ideas ringing in our head, let's turn to prayer and ask God to help us trust him. Father, we pray that you would help us to trust. We're absolutely astonished by the sort of extreme nature of this story and the way Abraham is pushed to trust, and yet he's able to trust. And yet that helps us understand an even more extreme story, the story of the cross and what Jesus went through, how he is that substitute for us. Father, I pray that you'd help us to trust him, to trust in the rescue he secured from our biggest enemies of death and sin and its consequences. Father, I pray that you help us to walk as people of faith, whatever comes our way. Amen.